Marjorie Cohn is my guest on Truthout Interviews. She's here to discuss the seemingly never-ending conflict between Israel and Palestinian groups in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and the way in which Israel's actions against the people in Gaza City violates humanitarian laws. Her article on Truthout is entitled, "Israel Inflicts Illegal Collective Punishment on Gaza." Well, thanks for being on Truthout Interviews, Marjorie.
My pleasure, Ted.
Yeah, first off, the situation in Gaza City is ongoing. The number of Palestinian civilian deaths is mounting, and it doesn't seem like a ceasefire is in the offing anytime soon. In your article, you highlight how Israel has run afoul of humanitarian law. Can you talk about some of those violations?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the U.S. Senate voted unanimously to condemn Hamas for its unprovoked rocket attacks on Israel. But what is not penetrating the mainstream corporate media is that the Hamas started firing its rockets after Israel had mounted nearly 1 month of military operations in violation of the November 2012 ceasefire. And then the ostensible trigger for Israel's attack on Gaza was the horrific killing of 3 Israeli youths. But there was never any evidence that Hamas was responsible for those killings. Netanyahu has said that he can't really negotiate with the Palestinians because they don't speak with a unified voice. And so Hamas and Fatah formed a unity government, and Netanyahu is vowing to destroy that unity government. In fact, that is one of the points in this U.S. Senate resolution, is that the unity government should disband. So many people think that Netanyahu mounted this so-called Operation Protective Edge to destroy the unity government. Now, in terms of international humanitarian law, which is the laws of war, which we find enshrined in the Hague Regulations and the Geneva Conventions, there are principles known as distinction and proportionality. Distinction forbids deliberate attacks on civilians, and proportionality forbids disproportionate and excessive civilian casualties in comparison with military advantage. One of the things that Israel has been claiming and that a lot of the corporate media have been parroting is that the Israelis are using human shields.
You mean the Palestinians are using human shields?
Sorry, the Palestinians, yes, pardon me. Palestinians are using civilians as human shields. And yet there is no evidence that Hamas forces civilians to stay in areas under attack. It is permissible to target a home if there are combatants in the home. But Israel is warning people before it targets these homes, which goes against the whole theory that they are trying to kill combatants in the home.
Now, has the UN or any other sort of international body, group, if you will, come forward and highlight these with regards to Israel? I mean, this is an ongoing situation. This isn't anything that's new. This has been, you know, decades upon decades of conflict. And yet we keep lapsing back into this narrative wherein you have Palestinians launching attacks or Israel launching attacks, and it's going back and forth, and the conflict escalates, civilian casualties mount, some sort of tentative peace happens, then the process starts over again. The conflict starts to mount again. And it's because, in a way, you do have two more extreme voices within the two camps. Hamas is definitely a much more extreme political party, if you will, and as that the United States identifies them as a terrorist organization. So it's very difficult for the United States to forge any kind of peace agreement with Israel, with Hamas, when they've already been dedicated sort of to the destruction of Israel.
First of all, there are reasons beside Hamas for the United States' support of Israel. And if you look at the direct translation of what Hamas said, they didn't say that Israel should be destroyed. They said that the Zionist state shall vanish from the map. that is directed at the Israeli government, not at the Jewish people. And I think that that confusion needs to be clarified. The U.S. support of Israel has to do with AIPAC, the very strong pro-Israel lobby in the United States, going back to 1967, when the United States first really saw Israel as a strategic ally in the Middle East. And also this culture of supposed shared values. Most people in the United States support Israel because they think Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And Israel is a democracy if you're Jewish. If you're not Jewish, then there is no democracy. But in terms of the UN Human Rights Council, which has 45 members from 45 different countries, just voted 29-1 with 17 extensions that an international inquiry should be mounted into the commission of war crimes by Israel in Gaza. The one state that voted against this referral and this investigation was the United States. And the 17 members who abstained were mainly European Union countries. But in terms of how this cycle of violence will end, and it is true, it's a heartbreaking, tragic thing that has been happening over and over. And every 2 years, there is, Israel invades Gaza with overwhelming force. The Palestinians throw their primitive rockets, and the United States and Israel talk about Israel's right to self-defense, nothing about the Palestinians' right to self-defense, and it just happens again. And meanwhile, the occupation continues. As long as the occupation continues, this cycle of violence will continue. And my feeling, and the feeling of many other people, is that there is a nonviolent solution to this, and it's something that is growing. The support is growing for it, and with this most recent invasion and bombing by Israel, support is growing even more, and it's called Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, or BDS. It was inaugurated in 2005 by a call from Palestinian civil society, I think 130 Palestinian groups, dedicated to end the occupation, the colonization of Arab lands, dismantle the barrier wall, which encroaches on Palestinian territory, which the International Court of Justice 10 years ago said was illegal, and support the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. BDS is growing. The American Studies Association, many groups now, the Presbyterian Church, the Bill Gates Foundation, are boycotting and divesting from Israeli corporations that support the occupation. Netanyahu attacked BDS. He sees that as a real threat. And there's been legislation introduced in various parts of the United States against BDS, even though boycott is something that during the civil rights movement we respected, we admired, we saw that it was very effective. It was a nonviolent way to achieve equal rights. So I see the BDS movement ultimately over time as growing and as promising a nonviolent resolution to this situation.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the recent suspension of flights into Ben Gurion Airport in Israel, it panicked Israel very quickly because that has an economic impact directly. If suddenly you suspend flights from the United States and from major parts of Europe into Israel, there's a lot of goods that are coming in through air transport, and also people coming to Israel to do business. And suddenly that has a direct economic impact.
That's true. And speaking of economics, if it were not for the $3 billion a year that the United States gives to Israel, more than we give to any other country, in military aid, Israel could not be doing what it's doing to the Palestinians. Also, I just want to say one thing about the so-called ceasefire proposal that Egypt and Israel and Tony Blair brokered without any input from Hamas at all, Hamas being one of the parties. But this ceasefire proposal would have just maintained the status quo, and so Hamas rejected it. Hamas has proposed a 10-year truce, opening the border crossings, international seaport and airport, for Gaza, expanding the fishing zone, and a commitment that Israel would not interfere with the Palestinian government or hinder reconciliation among the Palestinian forces. And yet that is not being discussed. But Netanyahu, once Hamas said, no, we're not going to go for your ceasefire, it really just maintains the status quo. Netanyahu said, well, now that you've rejected the ceasefire, that gives our invasion legitimacy. And really, the implication was that it was not legitimate before. So I think that it's important for Truthout and for other alternative media to get the out there. You saw what happened on TV when correspondents dared to report the facts unvarnished and what was happening to Palestinian civilians. There's tremendous pressure by Israel on the U.S. government and on the corporate media to give just one side of the picture, and that's a very slanted, distorted picture.
All right. Well, Marjorie, I want to thank you for being on Truthout Interviews.
My pleasure, Ted. Thank you so much.
You can read Marjorie's piece. It's entitled Israel Inflicts Illegal Collective Punishment on Gaza. Thanks for watching Truthout Interviews. I'm Ted Asregadoo, and we'll see you next time.